Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. It's the dead of night in the jagged hills of Chechnya, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine and cordite. A squad of young Russian conscripts, remnants of the Soviet-era draft system still lingering in the early 2000s, huddles around a flickering campfire outside their makeshift barracks. They've been posted to a remote outpost near the village of Vedeno, deep in the North Caucasus, a region scarred by two brutal wars between Russian forces and Chechen separatists. The First Chechen War, from 1994 to 1996, left thousands dead, and the landscape dotted with ruins. The second, erupting in 1999, dragged on with guerrilla ambushes, IEDs, and accusations of atrocities on both sides. But tonight, the threat isn't rebels or landmines. It's something far older, something that whispers from the earth itself. These soldiers, many barely out of their teens, were part of the 58th Combined Arms Army, stationed at what was colloquially known as Base Krasny Yar, Redcliffe, a fortified compound built atop Soviet-era bunkers overlooking a network of ancient caves. The base was established in 2001 as a forward operating post to control the Argon Gorge, a strategic choke point for insurgent movements. Historical records confirm that Chechnya's caves have long been hideouts. During World War II, they sheltered partisans against the Nazis, and in the 19th century, Imam Shamil's fighters used them in the Caucasian War against the Tsars. But locals spoke in hushed tones of these caverns, not just as refugees, but as living entities, haunted by the spirits of the damned, where the walls breathed and the shadows hungered. Our story comes from declassified reports, anonymous veteran forums, and a few leaked audio recordings from the era. In 2004, during a lull in the fighting, a reconnaissance unit from Krasny Yar vanished without a trace after reporting anomalous activity in one such cave. They claimed it was alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, echoing with voices that mimicked the dead. Was it psychological warfare from hidden enemies? Mass hysteria induced by the stresses of combat? Or something paranormal, tied to the haunted barracks where strange occurrences had been building for months? I've pored over the facts. Satellite imagery from that period shows no signs of battle, no bodies recovered, just an empty camp. The official line was "lost in action," but whispers persist. Tonight, we'll delve into the testimonies of those who survived the prelude, pieced together like fragments of a shattered mirror. If you've served, you know the fog of war blurs reality. But what if the fog itself is watching? Pull up a chair, dim the lights, and let's uncover what happened at Krasny Yar. Could a cave truly swallow men whole? And why did the hauntings start in the barracks long before? Chapter 1. Arrival at the Red Cliff. My name is Sergei Ivanov. I was 19, conscripted straight from Novosibirsk, and in the spring of 2004 I still believed the worst thing waiting for me in Chechnya was a bullet from an unseen sniper. The truck ride from Grozny took 8 bone-rattling hours. We sat shoulder to shoulder on metal benches, rifles between our knees, helmets clanking against the canvas roof every time the driver hit a crater. Sergeant Volkov rode up front in the lead BTR, barking orders through the hatch whenever the convoy slowed. Eyes sharp, mouths shut, he told us at the last checkpoint. This isn't training anymore. The road climbed steadily into the foothills, leaving the flatlands behind. Pine forests closed in, dark and dripping from recent rain. Mist hung between the trunks like smoke that refused to clear. By late afternoon, the Argonne Gorge opened below us, a deep scar cut through limestone and granite. On the far side rose sheer cliffs streaked with black water stains. Somewhere in those walls were the caves the officers kept mentioning in briefings, old smuggling routes, rebel hideouts, places where men disappeared and stayed disappeared. Base Krasny Yar appeared without warning. One moment we were grinding up a switchback. The next, the trees parted, and there it was. A grey rectangle of concrete buildings perched on a narrow plateau, ringed by coils of razor wire and sandbag emplacements. 3 watchtowers stabbed upward, their searchlights already sweeping even though sunset was still an hour away. A faded red star was painted on the largest bunker wall, half covered by newer camouflage netting. The place looked like it had been dropped here 30 years earlier and forgotten. We dismounted in a cloud of diesel fumes. The air smelled of wet stone, pine resin, and something faintly sour I couldn't place. Captain Kuznetsov waited at the gate, arms folded, face carved from the same rock as the cliffs. He was a first Chechen war veteran. Everyone knew it because he never let anyone forget. "Welcome to the edge of the world," he said. "You will secure this position, you will scout the gorge, you will not die stupidly. Clear?" We mumbled affirmations and followed him inside. The main barracks block was 2 stories of chipped concrete, windows narrow as gun slits. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of old sweat and gun oil. Bunks were stacked 3 high along both walls, mattresses thin enough to feel the springs. Someone had scratched names and dates into the plaster. Vanya 2002 gone. Dima never came back. And the graffiti had been painted over but not scrubbed away. The paint still showed through in pale ghosts. Dmitri, the skinny Muscovite assigned to the bunk below mine, dropped his rucksack and whistled low. "Looks like they built this place on a graveyard." I told him to shut up. Superstition travels faster than orders in a conscript unit. We spent the rest of the daylight hours drawing ammo, checking radios, and learning the layout. The perimeter was tight. 1 main gate, a service road that snaked down to the gorge, and a footpath that vanished into the trees toward the nearest cave mouth. Beyond the wire, the ground fell away steeply. Anyone coming up had to climb straight into our fields of fire. In theory, it was perfect defensive ground. In practice, it felt like sitting on the lip of an open grave. That first night, the rain started just after lights out. It hammered the tin roof like distant artillery. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling cracks that looked like black veins running across the concrete. The building creaked with every gust. At some point, the wind found a loose panel and set it flapping in irregular rhythm. I told myself it was only the weather. Around 2 in the morning, the lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The generator shed was 50 meters away. We could hear it chugging steadily. No reason for the flicker. I rolled over, pulled the thin blanket tighter and tried to sleep. Then the vibration started. It came up through the floorboards first, a low thrum you felt more than heard, like standing too close to an idling tank engine, except there were no tanks running. The bunk frame trembled faintly. I sat up. Across the room, Dmitri was awake too, propped on one elbow, eyes wide in the dim red emergency light. Neither of us spoke. The thrum pulsed once, twice, then faded until I wondered if I had imagined it. Morning brought fog so thick the watchtowers vanished at 20 paces. We formed up for PT anyway, push-ups in the mud, sprints along the perimeter track, Sergeant Volkov counting cadence in a voice that cut through the mist like a knife. Afterward, Captain Kuznetsov called us into the ops room. Maps covered one wall, red and blue pins marking known cave entrances and last reported insurgent sightings. "Recon starts tomorrow," he said. "Pairs, full kit. You go no deeper than the first bend unless you have visual on hostiles. Report anything unusual. Anything." He paused, looked at each of us in turn. "And if you hear voices calling your name from inside those caves, you turn around and double time back here. Understood?" A few men laughed nervously. I didn't. I had heard the stories on the ride up, how the caves had swallowed entire patrols in '95, how the rock itself seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Locals called the biggest one Dookie's Throat, Spirit's Throat. They said it breathed. That evening, after chow, Dmitri and I stood outside the barracks smoking. The fog had lifted enough to show the dark mouths in the cliff face across the gorge. One opening looked larger than the rest, a black oval that swallowed light. As we watched, a single bat fluttered out and vanished upward. Dmitri exhaled smoke. "You feel it yet?" "Feel what?" "The place watching us." I flicked my cigarette into the mud. "It's just rock and wind." He gave me a long look. "Keep telling yourself that, Seryozha." We went inside. The barracks felt colder than it had the night before. My bunk seemed smaller, the ceiling lower. I lay down and stared at those ceiling cracks again. In the red light, they looked deeper, almost wet. For a second, I thought I saw one of them move, slowly, like a vein pulsing under skin. I closed my eyes and told myself it was exhaustion. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, the vibration returned, softer this time, steady, like a heartbeat buried somewhere beneath the foundations of Krasny Yar. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark. My name is Alexei Petrov. I was the one they put on the eastern watchtower most nights, because I didn't complain, and I could stay awake longer than most. At Krasny Yar, the tower was a rusted metal skeleton 20 meters above the plateau, reached by a narrow ladder that swayed whenever the wind picked up. From up there you could see the entire gorge, the black ribbon of the Argon River far below, the opposite cliffs pocked with cave mouths like empty eye sockets, and our own base huddled against the rock like something trying to hide. The night watch started at 2200. I climbed the ladder with my rifle slung across my back, night vision monocular clipped to my helmet, and a thermos of weak tea Sergeant Volkov had grudgingly allowed. The fog had rolled in again after dusk, thick enough that the searchlight beam turned into a solid white cone 10 meters out. I settled into the metal chair bolted to the platform, scanned the gorge once with the monocular, saw nothing but grey murk, and then settled in to wait. Around 0130, the radio in my earpiece hissed once. Sharp static, the kind you get when someone keys a mic too close to a power line. I pressed the talk button. "Tower East, go ahead." Nothing. Just the low hum of the generator drifting up from below. I tried again. "Base, this is Tower East. Radio check." Static answered. I figured atmospheric interference. The mountains played hell with comms, even on clear nights. Then the voice came. "Alexei." It wasn't over the radio. It came from inside my head, soft and clear, the way your own thoughts sound when you're half asleep. I froze. My name, spoken exactly the way my mother used to say it when I was late coming home from school. Patient, a little tired. I ripped the earpiece out, heart slamming against my ribs. The gorge was silent, except for the distant rush of the river. No wind, no movement. I told myself it was imagination, sleep deprivation, the cold seeping into my skull. I put the earpiece back in and forced my breathing to slow. Scanned the perimeter again. Nothing. An hour later, it happened again. "Alexei, come down." This time the voice had an edge, like someone trying to keep calm while something terrible was happening on the other end of a phone line. I stood up so fast the chair scraped metal on metal. I leaned over the railing, staring into the fog. The cave mouths across the gorge were invisible now, swallowed by white, but I could feel them there, watching. I keyed the radio. "Base, Tower East. I have anomalous audio. Request immediate relief." My voice sounded thin even to me. Volkov's reply came back clipped. "What kind of audio, Petrov?" Someone saying my name, not over comms, inside. Long pause. Then quieter. "Get your ass down here. Now." I descended the ladder faster than regulations allowed, boots ringing on the rungs. When I hit the ground, Sergeant Volkov was waiting with a flashlight beam in my face. "You look like shit," he said. "What exactly did you hear?" I told him. He listened without interrupting, jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. When I finished, he just nodded once. "You're off tower till dawn. Go smoke, clear your head, and keep your mouth shut about it." I didn't argue. I walked back toward the barracks, boots sinking in the mud. The main block loomed ahead, windows glowing dull yellow. As I passed the armory door, padlocked and chained, I heard it again. Not my name this time. A low murmur, multiple voices overlapping, too soft to make out words but unmistakably human, coming from inside the locked building. I stopped. The murmurs stopped too. Inside the barracks, the bunk room was half lit by the red night lights. Most of the section was asleep or pretending to be. Dmitri was sitting on the edge of his bunk, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. He looked up when I came in. "You hear it too?" I sat on my own bunk across from him. "What did you hear?" "Someone calling for help, in Chechen, then in Russian. Same voice, both times." He rubbed his face. Thought I was losing it. Across the room, Corporal Yuri rolled over. "You two whispering like schoolgirls. What now?" Dmitri kept his voice low. "The vents. Listen." We did. The ventilation ducts that ran along the ceiling were old Soviet steel, painted battleship grey. Normally, they just hissed faintly with air movement. Tonight there was something else. A soft, rhythmic breathing. In, out, in, out. Not mechanical. Organic. Yuri swore under his breath and pulled his blanket over his head. Dmitri and I stayed sitting, listening. After a minute, the breathing slowed, deepened, then stopped. Silence pressed in heavier than before. I lay back on my bunk. The ceiling cracks looked the same as they had the night before, dark veins spreading across the concrete. But now they seemed to pulse faintly in time with my own heartbeat. I closed my eyes. Sleep wouldn't come. Just before dawn, the vibration returned, stronger this time. The entire barracks floor trembled once, hard enough to rattle the metal bunks. Someone in the far corner yelped. Lights flickered. Then everything went still again. When the grey light of morning finally leaked through the windows, we formed up outside like nothing had happened. Sergeant Volkov ran us through PT. She same cadence, same insults. Captain Kuznetsov watched from the ops room doorway, arms folded, face unreadable. After chow, Dmitri caught me by the sleeve. "We're going in there today. The cave, first recon pair." I nodded. We both knew what he wasn't saying. Whatever was whispering from the vents and the tower and the locked armory, it wasn't staying down there. It was already inside with us. Chapter 3. The First Disappearance. My name is Corporal Mikhail Kuzmin. I handled signals at Krasny Yar, radios, sat phones, the encrypted link back to Grozny when the weather allowed it. Most nights I sat in the dimly lit comms shack next to the OPS room, headphones on, listening to the hiss of empty frequencies while the rest of the section slept or pretended to. The shack was a small concrete box bolted onto the side of the main barracks, windowless except for a narrow firing slit that looked out toward the gorge. Inside it smelled of warm electronics, stale coffee, and the faint ozone burn of overworked transmitters. That night, 3 weeks after our arrival, the temperature had dropped hard after midnight. Frost was already glazing the razor wire outside. I had just finished a routine check-in with the night patrol down in the gorge when Private Oleg knocked on the door frame. He was a quiet kid from Voronezh, barely 18, always volunteered for the shit details because he thought it would get him home faster. Tonight he had latrine duty, scrubbing the trench latrines behind the barracks with a bucket and a brush until they didn't smell like death. "Corporal," he said, voice low, "permission to step out for a smoke before I finish?" I glanced at the clock. 03:45. 5 minutes, don't wander, and take the flashlight. He nodded, pulled his greatcoat tighter, and disappeared into the dark. I heard his boots crunch on the gravel path that led around the back of the block. The door clicked shut behind him. I turned back to the radio, logging the time and signal strength. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I keyed the internal intercom. "Oleg, status." No answer. Static. I tried again. Nothing. A prickle ran down my neck. I stood, grabbed my rifle from the rack, and stepped outside. The cold hit like a slap. The searchlights on the towers were sweeping slow arcs, turning the fog into glowing tunnels. I walked the path Oleg had taken, flashlight beam cutting ahead. The latrine trench was 50 meters behind the barracks. Open pit, wooden bench seats, canvas screens that flapped in the wind. The bucket sat upright on the ground, brush balanced across the rim. No sign of Oleg. His footprints were clear in the frost, leading away from the trench toward the cliff edge where the plateau dropped straight down into the gorge. The prints went right to the lip, then stopped. No scuff marks, no sign of a struggle, just boot soles pressed into the frozen ground, then nothing. I swept the beam over the drop. The gorge wall fell away sheer for 200 meters. At the bottom, the river was a thin black thread glinting under moonlight. No body, no torn clothing caught on rocks, nothing. I ran back to the barracks, hammering on doors. "Rouse up! Missing man!" Within minutes, the section was outside in various states of dress. Greatcoats over underwear, rifles in hand, faces pale in the floodlights. Sergeant Volkov took charge immediately. Search parties, 2-man teams, perimeter first, then the service road. Kuzmin, you and Dmitri check the cliff path again. Everyone else fan out. We moved fast. Flashlights bobbed across the plateau. Names were called into the fog. No response. After 40 minutes, Volkov called it. No tracks beyond the cliff edge, no blood, no shell casings, no sign of forced movement. Oleg had simply walked to the drop and vanished. Back inside the barracks, the mood was heavy. Men sat on bunks staring at nothing. Dmitri kept rubbing his hands together like they were cold. "He wouldn't jump," he said quietly. "Not Oleg. He talked about his sister every day. Said he was counting the days till demob." Captain Kuznetsov arrived at 0500, still buttoning his tunic. He listened to the report without expression, then ordered a full inventory of Oleg's kit. Everything was there. Rucksack, spare magazines, letters from home tucked under the mattress. Even the cheap wristwatch he always wound too tight. Nothing missing, except the man himself. Volkov posted extra sentries on the cliffside and doubled the guard on the latrines. "Nobody goes anywhere alone after dark," he said, "not even to piss." But the damage was done. That night the barracks felt different, smaller, colder, the air thicker. I lay on my bunk, listening to the others breathe unevenly. Around 2000 the vibration came again, stronger than before. The floorboards creaked as if weight shifted beneath them. Somewhere down the row a man muttered in his sleep, then sat bolt upright with a gasp. I sat up too. In the red emergency light the ceiling cracks looked wet, glistening like fresh blood. One of them seemed to widen for a second, and then contract. I blinked hard. When I looked again, they were still. The next morning we searched the gorge from the access road. Ropes lowered, men rappelled down to check ledges. Nothing. Satellite pass later that day showed no heat signatures, no movement. Official log entry. Private Oleg Ivanov. Missing, presumed deserted or fallen during routine duty. No enemy contact observed. We all knew it was a lie. That evening, after stand to, I went back to the cliff edge alone. The frost had melted in patches during the day, but Oleg's last footprints were still visible. Perfect impressions, then empty space. I crouched, touched the ground where he'd stood. Cold. Ordinary. Then I heard it. A single, soft scrape. Like fingernails on stone, coming from below the edge. I leaned forward, peering down. The gorge wall dropped away into shadow. Nothing moved, but the scrape came again, slow, deliberate, moving sideways along the rock face. Not climbing up, not falling, just travelling. I backed away fast, heart in my throat. When I reached the barracks, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That the cliff was making noise, that whatever took Oleg wasn't finished looking. But lying in my bunk that night, staring at those ceiling veins that pulsed faintly in the dark, I understood something worse. The barracks wasn't separate from the caves anymore. It was connected. And something inside the rock had just reached up and taken its first piece. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. My name is Private Nikolai Sokolov. I was the medic attached to the Krasny Yar detachment. Barely 20, fresh from the medical academy in Rostov. Handed a field kit and told to keep these conscripts alive long enough for them to go home. In the spring of 2004, alive meant patching bullet wounds, treating frostbite, and handing out anti-malarials that never quite worked in the damp Caucasus air. But after Oleg vanished, the injuries I treated changed. They weren't from gunfire or shrapnel anymore. They were from the barracks itself. The infirmary was a converted storage room at the end of the main block. 2 metal cots, a steel cabinet full of bandages and morphine syrettes, a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord. The walls were the same grey concrete as the rest of the base, but here The cracks in the ceiling seemed to weep condensation that never dried. I kept a small kerosene heater running day and night. It did little against the bone-deep chill that settled in after dark. That first week after Oleg disappeared, the complaints started small. Corporal Yuri came in complaining of headaches, sharp, stabbing pain behind the eyes that worsened whenever he lay down. I checked his pupils, his blood pressure. Everything normal. Probably dehydration, I told him, handing him a canteen and 2 aspirin. He left, rubbing his temples, muttering about hearing things. I didn't press him. We were all hearing things by then. Then Private Leonid showed up at 0300 one morning, barefoot, greatcoat thrown over his undershirt. His arms were covered in bruises, deep purple fingerprints around both wrists, as if someone had gripped him hard and held on. "I woke up like this," he said, voice shaking. "Felt hands on me in the dark. Couldn't move." I examined the marks. Perfect impressions, no broken skin, no sign of self-infliction. The bruises were fresh, the kind that bloom within hours. I wrapped his wrists in gauze, gave him a mild sedative, and sent him back to his bunk with orders to report if it happened again. He didn't sleep that night. None of us did. By midweek, the infirmary had become a confessional. Men shuffled in one after another, eyes hollow, voices low. Private Grigory described waking to find his bunk shaking violently, as if an earthquake had struck only his corner of the room. Another soldier swore the mirror above the wash basin fogged over with breath that wasn't his. Condensation forming the outline of a face, mouth open in a silent scream. I listened, took notes, tried to stay clinical. But the stories overlapped in ways that made my skin crawl. Always at night, always in the barracks. I always accompanied by that low thrum vibrating through the floor. Captain Kuznetsov ordered me to log everything as combat stress reaction. "Keep them functional, Sokolov," he said. "We can't afford a psych ward out here." I nodded, but I kept a private notebook tucked under the medical supplies. Dates, symptoms, exact descriptions. Patterns emerged. The disturbances were strongest in the older part of the barracks, the section built directly over the original Soviet bunkers from the Great Patriotic War. Those bunkers had been dug into the cliff face, connected by narrow tunnels that ran beneath the plateau. Some of those tunnels, the engineers told me, still opened into the cave network below. One evening I went down there myself. The access hatch was behind the generator shed, a rusted steel door half buried in the ground. I took a flashlight, a pistol, and a length of rope tied to my belt. The ladder descended 20 meters into damp darkness. At the bottom, the air was thick, smelling of wet stone and something metallic, like old blood. The tunnel was narrow, ceiling low enough that I had to stoop. My boots echoed unnaturally, each step returning distorted, as if the rock was swallowing the sound and spitting it back wrong. I followed the main passage for about 50 meters until it widened into a small chamber. The walls were scored with old graffiti, Soviet soldiers' names, dates from 1943 and 1944, crude drawings of tanks and women. Some of the carvings were deeper, older, Chechen runes perhaps, or something predating the wars. In the center of the floor lay a pile of bones, human, yellowed with age, stacked neatly as if someone had arranged them. Femurs, ribs, a cracked skull with the lower jaw missing. I knelt, shone the light closer. No clothing remnants, No identification tags, just bones, polished smooth by time. Then the hum started. It came from the walls, deep, resonant, vibrating through the stone into my bones. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. The bones on the floor seemed to shift slightly, as if settling under invisible weight. I backed away, rope taut behind me, heart hammering. The hum grew louder, became a chorus of whispers, fragments of Russian, Chechen, something older. Names, dates, please. I scrambled up the ladder, slammed the hatch shut, and leaned against it, gasping. My hands shook so badly I could barely light a cigarette. Back in the infirmary, I poured myself a measure of medicinal vodka and sat staring at the notebook. The bruises, the voices, the shaking bunks. They weren't random. They were echoes of men who had died here before us, men whose bones were still stacked in the dark below. That night the barracks groaned louder than ever. Beams creaked without wind. Water dripped from the ceiling cracks in steady rhythm, pooling on the floor in dark stains. I lay awake, listening to the building breathe, slow, deliberate, alive. And I realized the caves weren't just below us. They were inside the walls. Waiting. Chapter 5. The Pulsing Heart. My name is Sergeant Leonid Volkov. I had served 14 years by the time Krasny Yar became my posting. 2 tours in the First Chechen War, 1 in Dagestan, countless border patrols. I thought I'd seen every way a man could break: bullet, bomb, betrayal, despair. I was wrong. The thing that broke us at Krasny Yar wasn't any of those. It was patient. It waited until we were inside its house before it showed us the teeth. By late October 2004, the unit was down to 23 effectives after Oleg's disappearance, and 2 others who had been medevaced for what the paperwork called acute combat fatigue. The rest of us were ghosts in our own uniforms, eyes sunken, hands trembling when we tried to field strip rifles. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by the same low thrum that now seemed to live inside our skulls. The barracks had stopped feeling like shelter. The walls sweated cold moisture even when the heaters ran full. Doors that had latched perfectly for months now refused to stay shut. They drifted open on their own, revealing empty corridors lit only by the red emergency strips. Captain Kuznetsov finally gave the order we had all dreaded. We map the main cave system, full strength. Demo charges, full combat load. If there's an insurgent cache down there, we find it and destroy it. If there's nothing, we confirm that too. His voice was flat, but his eyes betrayed him. Red-rimmed, darting to the ceiling cracks that had grown noticeably wider in the last week. We went in at first light on the 28th. 10 men, myself, Alexei, Dmitri, Nikolai, the medic, 4 riflemen and 2 sappers carrying satchel charges. Ropes secured at the main entrance across the gorge. Carabiners clipped, headlamps cutting pale tunnels through the damp. The descent was steep but familiar by now. We'd probed the outer passages enough times to know the first bend, the stalactite choke point, the narrow ledge above the underground stream. But today the cave felt different. The air was warmer, too warm for October at this altitude, and the hum was no longer distant. It was everywhere, vibrating through the rock under our boots, sinking with our heartbeats until it was hard to tell which was which. We pushed deeper than we ever had. Past the bone chamber Nikolai had found weeks earlier, past the side passages that branched like veins. The tunnel narrowed, then suddenly opened into a vast cavern we hadn't known existed. Our lights swept across it and seemed to shrink. The ceiling arched high enough to lose the beams in shadow. The floor sloped gently downward to a central depression, maybe 30 meters across. And in the center of that depression, something pulsed. It wasn't rock. It wasn't machinery. It was flesh-like, dark, glistening, veined with faint, luminescent threads that throbbed in slow rhythm. The surface rose and fell like a diaphragm breathing. Tendrils, thick as a man's arm, extended from the mass, snaking across the cavern floor, disappearing into cracks in the walls. The air around it shimmered with heat. The hum came from inside it, deep and organic, a bass note that rattled teeth and sternums. Alexei whispered beside me. "Mother of God!" I raised my rifle. "Form perimeter. Sappers, prep charges." The sappers moved forward cautiously, placing satchels at the base of the pulsing mass. Every step they took, the tendrils twitched, as if sensing them. One tendril lifted slowly, probing the air like a blind snake tasting scent. Dmitri backed up a step. His boot scraped stone. The mass contracted once, sharp, violent, then relaxed. The hum spiked into something almost like a voice, layered, overlapping, and fragments of screams and pleas in languages I recognized, and some I didn't. "Set timers for 5 minutes," I ordered. "We exfil now." We turned to leave. That was when it struck. A tendril lashed out faster than anything living should move. It wrapped around one of the riflemen, Private Pasha, and yanked him off his feet. He screamed, clawing at the slick surface as it dragged him toward the center. We opened fire. Bullets punched into the mass. It rippled like disturbed water, but didn't bleed. The tendril tightened, bones cracked audibly. Pasha's screams cut off. Another tendril snapped toward Nikolai. He dove aside. It grazed his leg, tearing fabric and skin. He hit the ground hard, gasping. Alexei and Dmitri dragged him back while the rest of us poured fire into the thing. The sappers hit the timers. We ran. So the cavern shook as we scrambled up the passage. Explosions rolled behind us, deep, muffled thunder. Rock cracked and fell in sheets. Dust choked the air. We burst out into daylight coughing, dragging Nikolai between us. Behind us, the cliff face groaned. A section of the entrance collapsed in a roar of stone and dust. We made it back to the base. Nikolai's leg was gashed to the bone, but he would live. The rest of us sat in the mud outside the barracks, staring at the gorge. Smoke drifted from the sealed cave mouth. For a few minutes we dared to hope we had killed it. Then the ground trembled again. Not an aftershock. Something deliberate. The vibration came up through the plateau stronger than ever. Inside the barracks, windows rattled in their frames, lights flickered. Men shouted from inside. We ran back in. The main bunk room was chaos. Our bunks had shifted. One had toppled completely. Ceiling cracks had split wide, black fissures, now weeping dark fluid that smelled of copper and rot. Shadows moved in the corners, tall humanoid shapes that vanished when we swung lights toward them. One of the riflemen from the patrol, Andrei, stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at his own hands. His palms were marked with the same deep bruises we had seen weeks earlier, only now they were fresh and spreading up his forearms like ink in water. Outside, the fog rolled in thick and fast, unnatural for the hour. Searchlights barely cut 10 meters. And from the direction of the collapsed cave mouth came a sound no demolition charge could explain. A low, wet heartbeat, steady and enormous, echoing up through the rock. We had not killed it. We'd only made it angry. And now it was rising. Chapter 6. Descent into Madness. My name is Captain Andrei Kuznetsov. Command of Krasny Yar had been mine for 18 months by the autumn of 2004, long enough to learn its rhythms. The way the wind howled through the Argonne Gorge at dusk, the precise interval between distant mortar thumps from rebel positions across the valley, the slow erosion of morale that came with every unanswered radio check. I had written letters to widows, signed off on medevac requests, buried men in shallow graves when the choppers couldn't land. I thought I understood endurance. After the demolition in the cavern, endurance became irrelevant. The explosions had sealed the main entrance, or so we believed. Dust still hung in the air the next morning, coating every surface in fine grey powder that tasted of limestone and something sharper. The vibration never stopped. It had changed, less a distant heartbeat now, more a constant tremor underfoot, like standing on the deck of a ship that refused to sink. Cracks in the barracks walls had widened overnight. Thin black lines snaked upward from floor to ceiling, weeping a thin, oily fluid that stained boots and left dark streaks on concrete. I called the men to the ops room at 600. 21 remained. Faces I had known for months looked alien. Cheekbones sharper, eyes too wide, mouths set in thin lines. Nikolai's leg was bandaged thick. He limped in on Dmitri's shoulder. Alexei sat nearest the map table, rifle across his knees, finger never far from the trigger guard. No one spoke until I did. "We lost Pasha," I said. "We hurt whatever is down there, but it isn't dead. We hold this position until relief arrives or until we can no longer hold it. No one leaves the wire without my direct order. Radios on open channel at all times. Questions?" Silence. Then Sergei raised a hand. "Sir, the shadows in the bunk room. They're moving even in daylight now." I had seen them too, tall shapes that slid along walls when no one stood between the light and the plaster. I nodded once. Noted? Double sentries inside the barracks. Keep lights on. The day passed in fragments. Patrols along the perimeter reported nothing. No tracks, no fresh insurgent sign, only the fog that refused to lift. Inside the wire, the base felt smaller, the buildings leaning inward as if the plateau itself was contracting. Men avoided the older sections of the barracks. The air there was colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent like wet pennies. When someone had to cross those corridors, they moved quickly, rifle up, never turning their back to the dark corners. Night fell early. By 1900, the vibration had grown teeth, sharp pulses that rattled teeth and made vision blur at the edges. I stood watch in the ops room, staring at the radio that had gone dead 12 hours earlier. No reply from Grozny, no static, just silence on every frequency. Around 2200, the first apparition appeared solid. It was Yuri. He had been on interior guard, walking the main bunkroom corridor. He came running into the ops room, face bloodless. "Captain, there's men in formation, drilling. They're not ours." I followed him. The corridor lights flickered, then steadied on dim yellow. At the far end, under the red emergency bulb, I stood 8 figures in greatcoats and steel helmets. Soviet pattern, the kind issued in the 40s. They moved in perfect unison. Shoulder arms, present arms, order arms. No sound except the scrape of boots on concrete and the low click of rifle slings. Their faces were pale, eyes black pits. One turned his head toward us as we approached. The movement was too smooth, too liquid. Yuri raised his AK. Halt! The formation stopped instantly. The lead figure, the one who had turned, tilted his head. His mouth opened. No sound came out at first. Then a voice, multi-layered, spoke from everywhere and nowhere. Relief has arrived. The words echoed inside my skull. Yuri fired. The burst stitched across the figures. Bullets passed through them like smoke. The shapes rippled but held formation. Then they advanced, one measured step at a time. We fell back. Doors slammed behind us. In the bunk room, men were already barricading with bunks and footlockers. Nikolai sat against the wall, morphine syringe empty beside him, leg oozing through fresh bandages. "They're not ghosts," he whispered. "They're waiting." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows so hard the glass bowed inward. Searchlights caught movement in the mist. More shapes circling the perimeter, always just beyond the wire. The vibration peaked. A low groan rolled through the foundations. Somewhere deep below, stone cracked. I ordered the last of our demo charges rigged on the main support pillars inside the barracks. If it came to it, we would bring the roof down on ourselves, rather than let whatever was rising take us piece by piece. Men wrote final notes on scraps of paper, tucked them into pockets. Some prayed quietly. Others stared at the ceiling cracks that now gaped wide enough to show darkness beyond. At 0347, the power failed completely. Generators died without sputter or warning. Darkness swallowed the base. Only weapon lights and chem lights remained, small green and red stars floating in black. Then the pulling began. It started with Private Andrei. He had been sitting near a window, staring out. A shadow detached from the wall behind him, long-fingered, impossibly tall, and wrapped around his shoulders. He didn't scream. He simply stood, walked toward the door, and disappeared into the corridor. We heard his boots echo away, steady and calm, as if answering a summons. 2 more followed in the next hour. No struggle, no fight, just quiet obedience. I gathered the remainder in the center of the bunk room. 16 men now. We formed a circle, backs together, weapons outward. The vibration was deafening, felt more than heard. The floor tilted once, hard, throwing us against each other. Cracks raced across the concrete like lightning. From below came a wet, tearing sound, as if something enormous was forcing its way upward. I looked at their faces in the chem-light glow. Boys who had once talked about girls, and football, and demob dates. Now they were soldiers waiting for the end. "Hold," I said. My voice cracked on the word. The barracks shuddered again. A fissure opened in the floor near the far wall. Black, breathing cold. Tendrils emerged, thin at first, then thickening, glistening. They reached, searching. And in that moment, I understood the final truth. We had not invaded the cave. The cave had invaded us. It had been patient. It had learned our names, our fears, our dead. It wore their faces now, and it was coming home. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Unit. My name is Dmitri Kuzin. I was the last one out. By the first week of November 2004, Krasny Yar no longer resembled a military base. The concrete barracks had begun to slump inward like melting wax. Fissures raced across the plateau floor, exhaling cold vapor that smelled of wet earth and copper. The fog never lifted. It thickened until the searchlights only painted glowing spheres 10 meters in front of the towers. Inside those spheres, shapes moved. Tall, deliberate, always just outside clear sight. We stopped calling them apparitions. We called them guests. The vibration had become constant, a low roar that lived in our chests. It drowned out conversation. We shouted to be heard. Sleep was impossible. Men sat with backs to walls, rifles across laps, staring at the dark corners where the red emergency lights no longer reached. The ceiling cracks had opened into black mouths wide enough to fit a fist. From them dripped that same dark fluid, pooling on the floor in slow, deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing if you stared long enough. Captain Kuznetsov gathered what remained of us, 14 men, on the evening of the 3rd. We stood in the centre of the main bunkroom, the only space still lit by chemlights clipped to weapon slings. The floor tilted noticeably now. Footlockers slid toward the widening central fissure. Kuznetsov's face was grey under the green glow. His voice cut through the roar. We have one satchel charge left. We take it down. We place it on the heart. We detonate. If we survive the collapse, we move to the service road and signal for pickup. If not, he let the sentence hang. No one needed the rest. No one argued. We had seen what happened to those who waited. Andrei had walked out the door, smiling. Pasha had been pulled screaming into stone. The guests no longer hid. They stood in plain sight now. Figures in tattered greatcoats and helmets, faces pale and eyeless, mouths moving in silent formation. They drilled in the corridors, marched through walls, vanished when we fired. But they always returned, closer each time. We roped up at the collapsed cave mouth just before midnight. The entrance had partially reopened during the night. Stone shifted by unseen force, creating a jagged tear barely wide enough for one man at a time. Kuznetsov went first, satchel charge strapped to his chest. I followed. Then Alexei, Nikolai limping behind on a makeshift crutch, Sergei covering our rear. The others stayed topside to hold the perimeter and man the radio that still refused to answer. The descent was different. The passages had changed. Walls that had been smooth limestone now pulsed with thick veins of the same luminescent thread we had seen in the heart chamber. The air was hot, humid, carrying the scent of living tissue. Our boots sank slightly with each step, as if the floor had softened. The hum was deafening, layered voices chanting in unison, names we recognized. Oleg, Pasha, Yuri, men from units long gone before ours arrived. We reached the main cavern in under 20 minutes. The heart was larger now. It filled the depression completely, surface rising and falling in deep, laboured breaths. Tendrils had thickened into cables as wide as thighs. They snaked upward, disappearing into the rock ceiling. The luminescent veins glowed brighter, casting blue-green light that made our faces look corpse-like. Kuznetsov stepped forward without hesitation. "Cover me." We formed a semicircle, weapons raised. The heart contracted once, sharp, violent. Tendrils lashed out. One wrapped around Nikolai's crutch and yanked. He fell hard, screaming as the bone in his injured leg grated. Alexei fired full auto into the mass. Bullets disappeared without effect. Sergei dragged Nikolai back while I laid suppressive fire. Kuznetsov reached the base of the heart. He knelt, set the timer for 30 seconds, pressed the detonator. The device beeped once. Confirmation. He turned to us. "Run!" We turned. The cavern shook. Tendrils whipped through the air. One caught Sergei across the chest. He flew backward, slamming into the wall. Bones snapped. He didn't get up. Another tendril snaked toward me. I dove aside, It grazed my shoulder, tearing fabric and skin. Burning cold spread from the wound. We scrambled up the passage. Behind us, the heart screamed, a sound like 1,000 throats tearing at once. Stone cracked overhead. Boulders fell in slow motion, then faster. The tunnel narrowed, then widened again, as if the rock itself was breathing. We burst onto the plateau into blinding snow. The base was collapsing. The main barracks block tilted sideways. One wall had already fallen inward. Men shouted from inside, cut-off cries swallowed by the roar. The fissure in the floor had widened into a chasm 20 meters across, swallowing tents, generator shed, watchtower foundations. Searchlights toppled, their beams spinning wildly before winking out. Kuznetsov emerged last. He shoved me toward the service road. "Go! Signal!" I ran. Behind me, the ground split wider. Kuznetsov turned back once, toward the barracks, toward the men still trapped. A tendril erupted from the fissure, wrapped around his legs, dragged him down. He fired his pistol into the dark until the slide locked open. Then he was gone. I reached the road. The radio jeep was still there, half buried in fresh snow. I climbed in, keyed the handset, screamed coordinates. Mayday. Anything. Static answered. The plateau shuddered one final time. A deep groan rolled up from below. The entire cliff face sheared away in a slow-motion avalanche. Thousands of tons of rock sliding into the gorge. Dust and snow billowed upward, blotting the stars. When it settled, the base was gone. Only a raw scar remained on the mountainside, and steaming in the cold. No bodies, no wreckage, just silence. I walked for 3 days, found a Chechen shepherd on the 4th morning. He didn't ask questions. He gave me bread, water, pointed me toward the nearest Russian checkpoint. They found me delirious, frostbitten, babbling about a living cave. The official report read, "Avalanche during routine patrol, unit lost to natural disaster." No mention of the heart, no mention of the guests. I know what happened. The cave didn't just take us, it kept us. Every scream, every name whispered in the dark, every shadow that drilled in formation, they're still down there, waiting for the next unit to arrive. Because Krasny Yar isn't empty. It's occupied, and it's hungry.